Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. A story that drifts in slowly, quiet enough to slip past your thoughts, and heavy enough to anchor you into the strange corners of history. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. There are stories about kings and queens that are easy to tell. They sit on thrones, they wear their crowns, and they ride in golden carriages while the people bow. That part of history is polished until it gleams. It is painted onto the walls of palaces and written into the first lines of schoolbooks. But behind the thrones, behind the jewels, and beneath the painted ceilings of palaces, there are shadows. They are the kind of shadows that rulers never wanted written down. And yet, somehow, they linger like the dust that never quite settles in old halls. Those shadows carry secrets about blood. Not just any blood, but royal blood. The lifeblood that kings believed must never be diluted, must never mingle with anyone too ordinary. For them, a dynasty was not just a family. It was a living creature, fragile and proud, forever at risk of falling apart. To hold it together, kings and queens often turned inward. They looked at their own families, and then further in, until the lines blurred, and the difference between sister and wife, between mother and bride, became harder to see. It sounds impossible to imagine, but history is not a place of comfort. History is slow and quiet and heavy, and it shows us again and again that what seems unnatural to us was once justified as divine necessity. Royal courts told themselves that ordinary marriages were dangerous. What if a foreign bride betrayed the kingdom? What if a common-born wife poisoned the sacred bloodline with her lowly heritage? What if the throne passed to someone who wasn't pure enough to be considered chosen by the gods? These were not idle fears for kings. These were obsessions. And obsessions have a way of turning into rituals. So, behind the throne, in the hush of guarded chambers, there were marriages that broke the boundaries of kinship. Kings who married their sisters. Princes promised to their aunts. And in the darkest whispers, rulers who took their mothers as wives, because no other woman was seen as worthy enough to share the throne. The world outside often never knew, or pretended not to. The crowd still cheered during festivals. Soldiers still fought wars in their names. Coins were still stamped with proud faces that looked confident and eternal. But if you peer closer at those coins, you'll notice how the faces begin to blur together. A sharp nose repeated again and again. A jawline that grows stranger from one generation to the next. Eyes that look too much alike. A family that slowly folds in on itself. History tends to write about battles, but dynasties fall as often from within as from without. And one of the most silent weapons was the bedchamber. The story begins not with one king, not with one dynasty, but with a pattern. Across empires, across centuries, the same belief reappears like a shadow stretching across time. That royal blood must stay royal at any cost. It is in this belief that kings found themselves trapped in choices that to us feel unthinkable. But to them, it was duty, ritual, and the very heartbeat of their power. If you walk through the ruins of palaces now, ruins where walls have crumbled and gardens have long turned to dust, you will sometimes feel that silence still. Stones don't speak, but they remember. And if they could whisper, they would tell you not about victories carved on triumphal arches, but about the strange, secret unions that took place when night fell, and the shadows stretched long behind the throne. Take, for example, the ancient courts of Egypt, where the pharaohs wore crowns shaped like cobras and falcons. There, the throne was not just political, it was divine. The pharaoh was considered a living god, the child of the sun, the one who connected heaven and earth. To marry outside the royal family was not just a political weakness, it was a betrayal of divinity itself. A wife had to be more than a queen, she had to be a mirror of the gods. Who could mirror the gods better than a sister? Or, in the rarest and darkest of cases, a mother herself? Those choices left a mark, not just in family trees, but in bodies. Generations of children were born with features that told silent stories of too much closeness. Thin jaws, soft bones, fragile health. The throne gleamed bright in festivals, but behind its shine, a dynasty could be crumbling, child by child. Egypt was not alone. The pattern appeared again in Rome, though cloaked in different language. Emperors wanted to seem eternal, chosen, sacred. Some would take wives who were far too close, and in the gossiping halls of senators whispers grew. But emperors held the sword, and gossip could not cut through steel. The empire marched on, while the emperor's private life grew darker. Centuries later, across the mountains of Europe, castles rose like teeth against grey skies. Kings looked to their bloodlines with the same anxious obsession. A family tree twisted inward, branch by branch, until it resembled less a tree and more a tangled knot. Spain's Habsburg kings, with their fragile jaws and haunted eyes, would one day become living monuments to the dangers of keeping royal blood too pure. But that is a story waiting in the distance, one that grows from these same shadows. For now, all we see is the beginning, the quiet decision that perhaps no outsider was ever worthy, that family must marry family, even if it meant walking into places that common folk would shudder to imagine. The shadows behind the throne are long because they are old. They stretch back to the first palaces, the first crowns, the first kings who believed they were not like other men. And from those shadows grew traditions that made sense only to the few who lived inside gilded walls. Imagine a torch-lit chamber, the stone walls painted with golden scenes of gods embracing gods. Imagine priests whispering that the king is Horus, the living falcon, and that his bride must be Isis, his brothers, and his sister, all at once. Imagine courtiers nodding silently, because no one dared to question what the gods demanded. This was not love, not in the way we understand it. It was ritual. It was politics. It was a belief that the sacred could not be touched by the ordinary. But over time, ritual becomes habit, and habit becomes truth. By the time the candles burned low, no one even flinched at the thought that a mother might become a queen once more, this time beside her son. The throne is heavy, not just with jewels, but with the weight of decisions like these. And for every grand festival that was recorded, there are stories unspoken, folded into the silence of history, where bloodlines ran in circles and kings married their mothers to keep themselves eternal. The shadows behind the throne were never empty. They were filled with quiet footsteps, whispered blessings, and a silence that was never broken by truth. For in those shadows, rulers found ways to justify the unjustifiable, all in the name of keeping their crowns. And so, the story begins here, in the half-light where kings believed themselves closer to gods, where dynasties curled inward like smoke, and where the first dark unions took shape. These shadows would not vanish. They would stretch across centuries, haunting empire after empire, until the crowns themselves began to break under the weight of blood too heavy and too tangled to bear. In the palaces of old, family trees were not grown like gardens, they were drawn like labyrinths. Every line and every branch carried weight, and behind those lines lay the hopes of entire kingdoms. But when rulers feared the outside world too much, when they believed that their sacred blood must never escape their walls, those trees began to twist back on themselves. What began as a symbol of divine continuity became something darker, an endless circle, closing tighter with each generation. Bloodlines were written not in the light of day, but in the quiet of chambers where scribes worked by candlelight. They wrote genealogies that looked impressive to anyone who didn't read too closely. They linked kings to gods, brothers to sisters, mothers to sons. The ink dried, and no one questioned it. A scribe's pen was as powerful as a crown, because once a name was written, once a bond was sealed on parchment, it became truth. And yet these truths were half-truths. Behind the shining pages of dynastic records lay hidden unions, the kind of unions that no chronicler described in detail. To name them was to risk making them too real, too visible. So instead, they were wrapped in phrases about divine necessity, about keeping the line pure, about the will of heaven. It was not a lie, not exactly. It was something more dangerous, a silence. Silence that hung over entire generations, so heavy that even centuries later, when historians look back, they find themselves piecing together fragments, whispers. Nan Bintweit here. The story of these bloodlines is not simply about who married whom. It is about the fears that drove kings to look inward, about the belief that the greatest threat to a dynasty was not war or rebellion, but dilution. And so the lines curved back like rivers flowing into themselves, until the same faces appeared again and again, carved into statues, painted onto portraits, stamped into coins. Look closely at those portraits. You will see it. The features begin to narrow, eyes sit too close together, chins recede, faces lengthen into something almost uncanny. Generations of kings stare back with expressions that seem tired, even in their youth. Those portraits are not just art. They are warnings painted in oils and marble, reminders that blood does not stretch forever when trapped inside its own cage. In Egypt, scribes traced bloodlines back to the gods themselves. A king was Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, and to keep this divine circle unbroken, marriages within the family became almost sacred rituals. Some queens were sisters, others were daughters, and in the most secretive of whispers, a mother might once again become a bride. These choices were not spoken of as scandal, but as devotion, as if human bonds mattered less than the eternal loop between heaven and earth. And yet, even in the golden halls of pharaohs, cracks appeared. Children grew sickly, dynasties thinned, and the gods remained silent. Priests explained it away, of course. Illness was a test. Frailty was the burden of the divine. But behind the walls, servants must have whispered. They must have seen the way bloodlines repeated themselves too closely, and they must have wondered how much of it was truly divine, and how much was simply too human. The same silence unfolded in other lands, centuries later. In the marble palaces of Rome, emperors claimed divinity not through gods of the Nile, but through gods of Olympus. Bloodlines were kept close, sometimes uncomfortably so. Gossip travelled through the Senate, rumours curled around the baths and markets. But who could challenge a man who held armies at his command? The records speak carefully, as if treading on glass, and what remains is not clarity, but shadow. Those shadows followed dynasties into medieval castles, where marriages were arranged not for love, but for power. And yet, power itself became a fragile thing when built upon too narrow a foundation. A king might have believed that marrying within his bloodline would strengthen the crown, but each decision carved away at the stability of his children. Slowly, over centuries, entire families grew weaker, their heirs fewer, their reigns shorter. Still, the belief held. Blood was everything. Blood was sacred. Blood was worth protecting, even if it meant bending nature itself. These were not decisions made by accident. They were deliberate, written in dark ink, preserved in secret chambers of palaces. If you listen carefully in those ruins now, you might almost hear the scratching of pens as scribes tried to make sense of what was never meant to be spoken aloud. What makes these bloodlines so haunting is that they were not just family matters. They shaped entire nations. A frail prince meant a frail kingdom. A childless king meant a war of succession. A dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own choices meant that borders shifted, armies marched, and countless lives were changed forever. The private choices of rulers became public fates for millions, and yet, even knowing the risks, rulers kept circling inward, because to them, the alternative seemed worse. A stranger's blood on the throne was unthinkable. Better to risk weakness in the family than to invite strength from outside. Better to marry a sister, a daughter, or, in the darkest corners of history, a mother, than to let the crown pass into hands unworthy. The silence in which these choices were made was as thick as stone walls. Rarely were they written openly. Rarely were they spoken aloud. And so, centuries later, we find ourselves piecing together fragments. Bones with strange deformities, portraits that reveal too much resemblance, chronicles that speak in half phrases. It is a history written in the dark, not with clarity, but with shadows. Perhaps that is why it feels so heavy. These were not scandals shouted from rooftops. They were quiet rituals performed in candlelight, justified by priests, signed by scribes, and hidden behind golden doors. The kings and queens who lived them must have known, on some level, that they were walking into dangerous ground. But fear of the outside world, fear of losing power, fear of breaking the illusion of divinity, these fears outweighed everything else. So the bloodlines turned inward, again and again, until generations of rulers were born already marked by the choices of their ancestors. Thin, fragile, pale. Sometimes brilliant in mind, sometimes weak in body, but always carrying the silent weight of centuries of decisions made in the shadows. And this is what history often forgets, that behind the grandeur of coronations and parades, there were small, quiet marriages written into family trees that bent the natural order. They are not the stories sung in ballads, but they shaped kingdoms as surely as any war or conquest. The shadows behind the throne stretched, and the bloodlines twisted within them. And though the rulers believed they were preserving eternity, what they truly built were dynasties fragile as glass, ready to shatter with the lightest touch. These stories were not lost. They were simply buried. Buried beneath gilded ceilings, beneath dusty records, beneath centuries of silence. And as we follow them deeper, into palaces where torches burn low and corridors turn endless, we find that the line between devotion and destruction becomes nearly impossible to see. For when kings wrote their bloodlines in the dark, they were not only sealing their own fates, they were writing the destinies of empires, quietly, one forbidden union at a time. The throne was never simply a chair of wood and gold. It was a promise, a fragile thread stretched from one generation to the next, linking the living to the dead, and the dead to the yet unborn. A king's greatest fear was not always the invader at the gate, or the assassin's knife in the night. Often, his deepest terror lived inside his own house, the possibility that his heir might be unworthy, impure, or touched by blood not fit for a crown. This fear grew ancient and deep, older than the empires themselves. Kings believed they ruled not only by power, but by blood, the sacred blood that marked them as chosen, different, divine. To let that blood mingle with the wrong lineage was to risk poisoning the very essence of the throne. And so the idea of a tainted heir haunted palaces more than famine, more than war. A famine could be survived. A war could be won. But a single child of the wrong blood could topple the illusion that kept a dynasty alive. Every precaution was taken. Advisors whispered of alliances, priests spoke of divine will, and scribes carefully penned the lineages that would justify each union. But under all the ceremony, the truth was simple: fear. Fear that a prince might grow up more common than royal. Fear that a queen might bear a son who looked too much like the world outside the palace gates. Fear that in the child's face, in the curve of the nose or the shape of the jaw, there might be evidence that the gods had turned away. In Egypt, this fear was sharper than anywhere else. For there, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the bridge between mortal and divine. His blood was not only precious, it was sacred. To let it dilute was to invite the wrath of gods who watched silently from temple walls. The temples themselves were decorated with carvings that reminded everyone of this sacred truth. The pharaoh was born of the sun god, and his children must remain as close to the divine spark as possible. The solution seemed simple to them. The blood must circle inward. A sister could be made a queen, a daughter could be promised to her father, and in whispers darker unions could be justified as holy necessity. The courtiers nodded, the priests gave their blessings, and the scribes recorded it without hesitation. No one dared ask the question that must have hung heavy in the silence. Was this truly the will of the gods? Or simply the desperation of men too afraid to trust anyone outside their walls? This fear was not bound to Egypt. Across the sea, in Greece and Rome, the same unease lingered. The gods were different, the rituals changed, but the dread of tainted heirs remained. For emperors, legitimacy was everything. An emperor could seize power with armies and politics, but to keep it, he needed the belief that his blood carried destiny. If that illusion cracked, rebellion could follow. And so, emperors too looked inward. They married close. They arranged unions that bound family to family until the line blurred. The results were often whispered in corridors rather than shouted in forums. Children frail from birth. Sons who never grew strong enough to hold a sword. Daughters who carried the pale, thin look of generations folded in upon themselves. Still, the fear of taint was greater than the fear of weakness. Better a sickly heir of pure blood than a strong heir with blood from outside the sacred circle. The fear itself became a kind of sickness, passed from one king to the next. You can see it in the records, though rarely written plainly. Chronicles speak of purity, of noble unions, of ancient rites. These are careful phrases, meant to disguise the deeper anxiety. But if you read them slowly, if you listen to the silence between the words, you can hear it, the heartbeat of fear. And what was this fear, if not the recognition that the throne itself was fragile? If kings truly believed their crowns were unshakable, if they truly believed their power was eternal, they would not have clung so desperately to the purity of their blood. Their obsession reveals their doubt. Their rituals expose their weakness. The fear of tainted heirs was, in truth, the fear of their own mortality. The realization that kingdoms rise and fall not by armies alone, but by the fragile bodies of children born behind locked doors. In medieval Europe, the same dread wound its way through stone castles. The noble families spoke endlessly of lineage, of noble descent, of unbroken blood. Marriages were arranged across cousins, uncles, nieces, always circling, always narrowing. They believed they were building strength, weaving a net that no outsider could pierce. But the net tightened until it strangled the very heirs it was meant to protect. Look at Spain, centuries later. The Habsburg kings, heirs of this same ancient fear, bore the marks of generations who had turned their backs on the outside world. Their faces were portraits of what happens when blood runs in circles too long. Elongated jaws, crooked teeth, frail bodies. The infamous Habsburg jaw was not merely a feature, it was a monument carved in flesh. A warning written across generations that fear can destroy more surely than enemies. And yet the fear never loosened its grip. To the rulers, the horror of taint outweighed even the evidence before their eyes. Sickly children, endless miscarriages, lines that dwindled instead of growing. Still they clung to the idea that purity was survival. The darker the truth became, the more tightly they gripped the illusion. For the ordinary people outside the palace gates, life moved differently. Farmers worked their fields, soldiers drilled in courtyards, markets hummed with trade. But above them, in gilded chambers, rulers told and retraced their bloodlines like a monk fingering prayer beads. Their every decision was guided by that quiet, consuming dread that the next heir might not be royal enough, divine enough, pure enough. The irony is sharp. In trying to protect their dynasties, they weakened them. In fearing taint, they courted decay. The throne, meant to stand eternal, was built upon children too fragile to bear its weight. And the fear itself, so deeply rooted, became the inheritance passed from father to son as surely as the crown itself. The ancient fear of tainted heirs is not a story of a single king or a single dynasty. It is a shadow that stretched across empires, across centuries, repeating itself again and again like a dark refrain. Every palace had its whispers, every family had its secrets, and every crown carried the same invisible burden, the terror of an heir who did not belong, or worse, who revealed too much of the truth hidden in the blood. In the end, this fear was not only about blood, it was about power. Blood was simply the language kings used to describe it, the mask they wore to hide their doubt. They told themselves they were guarding divine lines, but beneath that story was a simpler truth. They were guarding themselves, afraid of what would happen if the people realized that kings were only men and that crowns could pass to anyone. The fear made them prisoners. It built walls higher than stone, walls made of suspicion and ritual. And in those walls, dynasties withered, slowly, silently, until the fear itself seemed to become their only true heir. And so, when we walk through the ruins of palaces now, when we see the faded portraits, the broken tombs, the faces carved into stone, we are looking not only at kings and queens. We are looking at fear, preserved across centuries, written into the very blood of the families who ruled. It is a fear older than armies, deeper than politics, and it whispered in every chamber where kings lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, wondering if the child who would inherit their crown was already doomed by the very blood they tried so desperately to protect. The Nile runs slow, carrying its waters from far beyond deserts and mountains, feeding a land where the earth itself seemed to promise eternity. Temples rose along its banks, colossal and unyielding, filled with the scent of incense and the murmur of chants that had been whispered for centuries. In Egypt, the idea of a ruler was not limited to the mortal. A pharaoh was no mere king, he was the living embodiment of the gods, a bridge between heaven and earth. His body was sacred, his blood untouchable, his very breath believed to carry fragments of divinity. To keep such a lineage pure was not just politics, it was religion. Every decision about the pharaoh's marriage, every union, every child was weighed not only by advisors, but by priests who measured purity like gold. To marry beyond the royal bloods was to risk breaking the chain that bound the gods to their chosen family. And so, when a pharaoh looked for a bride, he often looked no further than his own house. Sisters became queens, daughters became wives. The family tree folded upon itself, not out of desire, but out of a belief that the throne demanded it. To outsiders, it might have looked unthinkable. But inside those temples, within those palaces, painted with scenes of divine unions, it was necessity. If the pharaoh was Horus, then his queen must be Isis. And Isis was not only his wife, she was his mother, his sister, a goddess who embodied all roles at once. This sacred loop was painted on walls and carved into stone. Gods married their sisters. Sons lay beside their mothers. It was a divine order, mirrored in the lives of kings who believed themselves living gods. The rituals justified what silence could not, and over time, it became not a scandal, but a tradition. Take Akhenaten, for example, the pharaoh who turned his eyes toward a single god, the Aten, and reshaped religion itself. In his reign, his daughter is believed to have become not only his child, but his consort. In carvings you see them together beneath the sun's rays, the Aten stretching hands of light toward both father and daughter, blessing them as if such a union carried no shadow at all. To Akhenaten, the marriage was not unnatural, it was a continuation of divine truth, an echo of heaven played out on earth. But behind the glow of sacred imagery, behind the walls of temples, the human cost was already showing. The children of these unions often bore the weight of fragile bodies, as if the blood itself protested against its confinement. Bones that bent too easily, limbs that struggled to grow strong, faces marked with the unmistakable echo of too much closeness. And yet, the throne demanded heirs, and heirs were born, one generation after another, carrying both the glory and the weakness of the system that created them. The logic was always the same. To marry outside the royal line was to risk taint, to allow the divine spark to mix with something ordinary, something less. Better, then, to keep the circle tight, even if it meant that fathers might one day take daughters as brides. For the throne was more important than the individual. The dynasty outweighed the body. And the illusion of eternity was worth more than the health of a single child. Priests blessed these marriages, presenting them not as scandal, but as holy. They drew on myth to cloak reality. Osiris and Isis, brother and sister, had produced Horus, the falcon god, who became the archetype of kingship. If the gods themselves had done it, then surely the pharaoh, their earthly reflection, was meant to do the same. Myth became shield, ritual became silence, and the walls of temples told the story in stone, erasing the discomfort of those who lived it. For the people, the pharaoh remained untouchable. They saw processions, golden masks, vast temples glowing in the sun. They did not see the private chambers, the fragile heirs, the daughters transformed into queens. To them, the divine illusion held. The Nile flowed, the crops grew, and the pharaoh ruled as he always had. But inside the palace, the bloodlines circled in upon themselves, slowly, inexorably. Even in death, the illusion was preserved. Tombs were filled with inscriptions that spoke of eternity, of divine unions, of everlasting kingship. Mummies were wrapped and sealed away, their faces painted with idealized features that bore little resemblance to the frailty hidden beneath the wrappings. The truth was buried as carefully as the bodies themselves, hidden beneath gold masks that smiled with godlike perfection. But archaeology has a way of unearthing what history tried to conceal. When modern eyes looked upon the remains of certain pharaohs, the truth became difficult to ignore. Deformities in the bones, signs of genetic weakness, evidence written not in ink, but in the very marrow of those who once ruled. The great Tutankhamun, often romanticized as the Boy King, was revealed by modern study to have suffered from numerous ailments: clubfoot, fragile bones, a body too weak for war or labour. His parents, it is believed, were brother and sister. He was the product of a dynasty folding in on itself, of choices made to protect bloodlines that ultimately betrayed the very children they were meant to preserve. Tutankhamun was not an isolated case. He was part of a pattern that stretched across centuries, repeated again and again, each generation trapped by the same fear of tainted heirs and the same solution of turning inward. The fear of impurity built dynasties that could not escape their own reflection, and the daughters of pharaohs were caught most of all. For them, the throne was not only inheritance, it was a marriage bed, a destiny chosen before they could speak. Imagine the silence of those chambers. A girl raised as both daughter and bride, taught from birth that her role was divine, that her body existed not for herself, but for the preservation of a line that stretched back to the gods. No scandal was spoken aloud. It was ritual. It was duty. And in that silence, the dynasty continued, child after child, generation after generation, until the walls themselves seemed heavy with the weight of what had been unspoken for centuries. The grandeur of Egypt remains in stone, but stone does not speak of suffering. It speaks of gods and eternity, of pharaohs and triumphs. Only in the cracks, in the fragile bones unearthed from tombs, in the faces reconstructed from skulls, do we glimpse the shadow that lay behind the gold. A shadow born of marriages that bound fathers to daughters, kings to children who were never given the chance to be simply children. The Nile still flows, patient and eternal, as if mocking the fragility of those who once believed themselves divine. The fields still green each year. The temples still rise against the desert sky. But the dynasties that tried to make themselves immortal through their blood are long gone. Their names survive, carved in hieroglyphs and whispered in history, but their bodies tell another story, a story of fragility, of weakness, of choices made in the name of purity that ultimately ensured their own decline. Pharaohs married their daughters not because of love, nor desire, nor scandal in the way we imagine it. They did so because they were prisoners of their own myths, bound by fear, convinced that to let their blood escape the family was to let their crowns crumble. In preserving their blood, they doomed themselves. And so, the story of Egypt becomes more than one of pyramids and temples. It becomes a story of families folded upon themselves, of dynasties that believed eternity could be written in blood, even as that blood grew thin and fragile. The silence of their palaces still lingers in the ruins, and the shadow of their choices still whispers through the desert wind. For behind the golden masks, behind the painted walls, behind the crowns shaped like cobras and falcons, lies the truth of what it meant to be both God and man. A ruler terrified of impurity, willing to bind himself to his own daughter to keep the illusion of eternity alive. When Alexander the Great's army swept across Egypt, the old gods did not vanish. The temples still stood, the Nile still rose and fell with its timeless rhythm, and the air still carried the incense of rituals unchanged for centuries. Yet into this ancient world came new rulers, Greeks who had marched with Alexander and carved out kingdoms from the fragments of his empire. Among them was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who claimed Egypt as his prize and crowned himself pharaoh. But in Egypt, a king could not simply be a conqueror. He had to be divine. The Greeks who settled in Alexandria, with their marble statues and language of philosophers, soon realised that to hold Egypt was to embrace its ancient rituals. The Ptolemies crowned themselves as pharaohs, adopted the symbols of Horus and Isis, and stood in temples where the walls still whispered of gods and bloodlines. And with the crown came the old obsession, the belief that the ruler's blood must never be diluted. Thus began a dynasty that would last for centuries, one that is remembered not only for its splendour, but for the shadows that haunted its palaces. The Ptolemies inherited more than a throne. They inherited the belief that purity was power, and so, like the pharaohs before them, they turned their gaze inward. Brothers doubted sisters, uncles took nieces as brides, and in rare, darker whispers, a mother might once again become the consort of her son. The palaces of Alexandria glittered like no other, built on the wealth of trade, where ships carried goods from the corners of the known world. Scholars filled the great library, astronomers charted the stars, poets recited verses to kings and queens who claimed to be divine. But behind the marble colonnades, the dynasty was already folding upon itself. The poison was not in the wine, nor in the daggers hidden beneath cloaks. It was in the blood. To the outside world, the Ptolemies displayed magnificence. They built towering lighthouses, temples carved with both Greek and Egyptian symbols, processions that dazzled the people. But within the walls of the palace, marriages were arranged with a cold precision. A sister was not only a sibling, she was a safeguard. A daughter was not merely a child, she was an heir to be bound more tightly to the throne. Love played no role, nor did desire. It was a strategy, a ritual of survival cloaked in the language of divinity. The result was a family tree unlike any other. Branches crossed back upon themselves, names repeated generation after generation, until the line blurred between father and brother, mother and wife. The dynasty became a mirror reflecting only itself, a closed circle that locked out the world while locking in its own decay. The palace, for all its grandeur, became a Whispers of poison drifted through its halls, not always in metaphor, but in reality. Brothers who were rivals, as well as husbands to their sisters. Sisters who plotted against brothers even as they shared thrones. Queens who carried the title of goddess, but moved like shadows, calculating survival in corridors heavy with suspicion. Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, stands in history as the most famous. She dazzled Rome, ensnared Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and carried the weight of her dynasty's end upon her shoulders. Yet even Cleopatra was born of this poisoned circle. She was the product of generations of intermarriage, her bloodline wound so tightly that the fragility of her ancestors lived in her body as surely as the crown lived on her brow. Her charm and wit could command empires, but the dynasty she inherited was already crumbling, not by armies, but by centuries of decisions made within palace walls. The fear that drove the Ptolemies was the same fear that had haunted the pharaohs. The dread of taint, the terror of impurity. To them, marrying outside the family was to risk losing Egypt itself. To let in foreign blood was to invite collapse. And so, generation after generation, they turned inwards, until the palace was filled not with strangers, but with mirrors. Each new heir looked more like the last, a reflection of a reflection, until even their portraits seemed to carry a sameness that borders on eerie. But the strategy that was meant to preserve the dynasty instead poisoned it. Fragile heirs struggled to live beyond childhood. Rivalries sharpened into bloodshed. The palace grew heavy with suspicion, where every feast might hide a cup laced with venom. Every embrace might conceal a knife. When blood is both weapon and shield, families turn upon themselves. And so, the Ptolemaic dynasty became infamous not only for its brilliance, but for its violence. Sisters were strangled in chambers, brothers drowned in baths, queens exiled only to return in vengeance. The throne was not passed gently from father to son. It was seized, contested, fought for within a family that had wedded itself too tightly to itself. And always, behind these struggles, lingered the belief that only royal blood could hold Egypt together, even as that very blood ate away at the strength of those who bore it. The irony is heavy. While scholars in Alexandria studied the stars and dreamed of infinite worlds, the rulers of that city were trapped in a cage of their own making. They looked inward until they could see nothing beyond themselves. They ruled an empire of trade, of culture, of science, yet their own family shrank into weakness, their brilliance clouded by the poison of their own traditions. The palace itself seemed to reflect this duality. On the outside, glittering banquets and festivals dazzled visitors. Inside, chambers echoed with whispered conspiracies, siblings plotting against one another, parents wary of children who might one day rise against them. Trust was rare, love rarer still. Only suspicion endured. When Rome finally cast its gaze upon Egypt, the Ptolemies were already shadows of their former glory. Cleopatra fought fiercely, wielding her beauty and her intellect like weapons, but her dynasty was already collapsing. The poisoned bloodline, the endless circle of marriages, had left too few heirs strong enough to hold against the weight of an empire as vast as Rome. The Ptolemies vanished, leaving behind ruins, name carved in stone, fragments of papyrus, and the legend of Cleopatra. But their story lingers as one of the most vivid examples of what happens when fear becomes ritual. In trying to protect their blood, they ensured its decay. In clinging to purity, they invited ruin. The palace in Alexandria is gone now, swallowed by sea and time. The waves wash over its stones, hiding what once glittered with gold and marble. But in the silence of the water, the story remains. The Ptolemies ruled as gods, but lived as prisoners of their own fears, marrying sisters, marrying daughters, and carrying forward a poisoned legacy written not in ink, but in blood. And so, the story of Egypt did not end with pyramids and temples. It ended in a palace where the walls themselves seemed heavy with suspicion, where every banquet might be a trap, and where the children of kings carried the silent weight of centuries of choices made in the name of purity. The poison of the Ptolemies was not merely in their palace, it was in their veins, a shadow passed from one generation to the next, until the dynasty itself dissolved into history. When the sands of Egypt began to slip from the grasp of the Ptolemies, another power was already rising. Across the Mediterranean, Rome had grown from a city of farmers and soldiers into a vast republic, and from that republic into an empire that swallowed kingdoms whole. It took Egypt into its embrace not by accident, but as part of a hunger that seemed endless. Yet Rome did not simply inherit Egypt's wealth, its grain, or its temples. It also inherited the language of divinity, the rituals of purity, and the quiet idea that rulers were not men, but something more. Rome had been built on laws and traditions, on senators debating, on citizens voting. But once Augustus placed the laurel crown upon his brow and declared himself the heir not only of Caesar, but of something greater, the empire shifted. Emperors were not merely rulers, they became gods in the flesh, their images carved into marble and worshipped in temples. Their blood was not common blood, it was sacred, a thread that must be preserved and protected, even when protection meant crossing lines that once seemed unthinkable. For in Rome, as in Egypt, the fear of dilution crept like a shadow. To share the throne was to risk losing it. To trust outsiders was to gamble with destiny. And so, emperors began to turn their gaze not outward, but inward, searching within their own families for alliances, for brides, for heirs. What was once taboo became a whispered possibility. What was once a scandal became a strategy. Caligula is remembered for madness, but beneath the stories of cruelty and indulgence lies the shape of a ruler who saw no boundary between himself and divinity. He called himself a god, dressed as Jupiter, and demanded worship as though Rome itself existed to bow before him. And in that belief, he also blurred the lines of family. His sisters were not merely sisters. They became objects of his possession, bound to him in ways that broke the old Roman codes. In hushed corridors, it was whispered that he lay with them, binding his family to himself with vows unspoken, vows forbidden. The Roman people were not blind to these shadows. They murmured, they gossiped, but they also watched, powerless, for an emperor was beyond law, beyond reproach. If he declared himself divine, who could deny him? The Senate trembled, the people whispered, but the palace continued its rituals. Caligula's reign was short, cut down by daggers, but the whispers of what he had done lingered. In them lay the seed of something larger, the idea that emperors could, and perhaps must, entangle themselves in forbidden unions to keep power from slipping into the hands of strangers. And so it continued. Nero, remembered for fire and song, is said to have taken his mother Agrippina into his chambers. Whether rumour or truth, the story itself reveals what Rome believed of its rulers, that their appetites and their power were unchained, and that in their quest to keep the empire bound to their blood, no vow was too sacred to break. A mother, once the giver of life, became the object of possession. Rome whispered of it with both disgust and awe, for to imagine such a union was to imagine the emperor himself stepping beyond humanity, into a place where blood and body were only tools of power. The palaces of Rome glittered like those of Alexandria, their marble floors reflecting torchlight, their halls filled with the scent of feasts and the echoes of music. Yet behind the curtains, the same silence that haunted Egypt crept in. Sisters became pawns, daughters became brides, mothers became consorts in rumour, if not in truth. Each bond that should have been sacred was twisted into a political knot, tying the emperor's blood tighter and tighter to itself. To the empire beyond, this was hidden behind grandeur. Rome's legions marched across continents. Its aqueducts carried water. Its amphitheatres filled with laughter and blood. But within the palaces, the family of Caesar folded in upon itself, consumed not only by ambition, but by the belief that their blood was unlike any other. They ruled not because of the Senate, nor the people, but because they were chosen by fate, by gods, by destiny. And destiny, they believed, could not be shared with those outside the circle. Each emperor carried this burden differently. Some cloaked it in ritual marriages, others in rumours too heavy to dismiss. Domitian, centuries after Caligula, was said to keep his niece as both daughter and consort. The empire looked on, weary but resigned, for what was scandal when placed against power? Rome had grown used to excess, to whispers of cruelty, to the idea that emperors lived in a realm beyond morality. The forbidden became expected, the shocking became routine. But these vows, though cloaked in divine language, carried poison. Just as in Egypt, the circle of blood narrowed, heirs grew fragile, madness flickered in the eyes of rulers, and suspicion spread like smoke. To marry a sister, to claim a mother, to keep the bloodline pure, was not to strengthen the throne, but to hollow it. The emperors of Rome stood in marble as gods, yet within their veins, the very strategy meant to preserve them slowly eroded their line. and as the empire stretched further, the palace grew darker. Children born of these unions carried the weight of both privilege and fragility. Rivals sharpened daggers in the shadows, while within the family, trust became impossible. If a mother could be a consort, if a sister could be a bride, then every bond was a threat. Love dissolved into suspicion, and suspicion into murder, yet Rome endured. Unlike Egypt, it did not collapse with a single dynasty. Emperors rose and fell, some by poison, others by blade, still others by the whim of soldiers who declared them gods one day and corpses the next. The empire itself survived the madness of its rulers, but the stories of their forbidden vows remain, carved into the memory of history like shadows etched in stone. It is easy to dismiss these tales as exaggerations, the inventions of gossiping senators or scandal-hungry chroniclers. And yet, the persistence of these stories tells us something deeper, that Rome itself expected its rulers to step into forbidden realms, that the line between power and desire, between divinity and depravity, was never clear, that an emperor was not only a man, but a symbol, and in his body, in his bed, the empire itself was both created and corrupted. As the centuries passed, the forbidden vows of Rome echoed outward. They became part of the tapestry of imperial life, not just in Rome, but in kingdoms yet to rise. The idea that blood could not be shared, that a dynasty must turn inward, spread like a shadow from empire to empire. Each ruler who married sister or daughter, each who whispered vows where none should be spoken, carried forward not only their own story, but the long, unbroken thread of rulers who believed their blood was not like ours. Rome did not end with a single scandal. It burned, it fractured, it fell into silence. But its emperors remain in memory, their faces carved in marble, their whispers carried in the writings of those who survived them. And within those whispers lies the same unease that once haunted Egypt, the knowledge that in the name of purity, rulers will step into darkness, binding themselves with vows too heavy to be spoken aloud. The empire stretched across the known world, yet within the emperor's own palace, the circle tightened until it strangled. Rome's emperors, clothed as gods, crowned in laurel, lived lives marked not only by conquest, but by the shadows of forbidden vows. And though centuries separate us from their world, the silence of those chambers still lingers, heavy with the weight of vows spoken where no vows should ever be. In the long shadow of Rome's palaces, where marble gleamed under torchlight and corridors whispered with intrigue, one figure rose who seemed less a man than a fever dream given flesh. His name was Gaius Caesar, but the world remembers him by the childhood nickname given when he followed his father's soldiers in miniature boots, Caligula. To the legions, he was once a mascot. To history, he is remembered as a storm, a nightmare woven of blood and lust, whose reign revealed the full decay of a dynasty obsessed with its own sanctity. Born into the Julio-Claudian family, Caligula carried the burden of a bloodline already heavy with suspicion. His great-uncle Tiberius had retreated into shadow, ruling from an island fortress where whispers of cruelty, indulgence, and perversion hung like smoke. The dynasty he inherited was one where love was scarce, and survival demanded masks. Caligula learned early that trust was dangerous, that family could both raise and destroy, that blood was both shield and poison. When he stepped onto the throne, Rome exhaled with relief. At last, a young emperor, golden-haired, smiling, charming. Crowds filled the streets, showering him with adoration, believing the nightmare of Tiberius had passed. But power is a strange alchemy, and in Caligula, it ignited something that consumed both him and those around him. The boy in boots became the man who believed himself more than human, a god draped in flesh. untouchable, unchained. And with divinity came desire. Not the simple hunger of mortals, but something deeper, stranger, darker. His sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina, Livilla, became not merely family but companions, consorts, objects of both affection and possession. Rome whispered that his nights were shared with them, that the sacred bonds of blood were twisted into vows unspoken. At feasts, he would lean too close, laugh too warmly, gesture too intimately, until what was whispered in shadows was laid bare in flickering lamplight. His palace became a theatre where the boundaries of kinship dissolved. Drusilla, his favourite, seemed to occupy a place no sister should. She was seated beside him as though she were empress, her name invoked in oaths, her image cherished as if she were more than mortal. When she died suddenly, Rome shuddered as Caligula declared her a goddess, her divinity proclaimed by imperial decree. Grief twisted into obsession, mourning blurred into worship. The emperor who saw himself as Jupiter now saw his sister as Juno, and the union of god and goddess was imagined not as blasphemy, but as destiny. But behind these gestures lay something darker still. Caligula's desires were not only for bodies, but for power, domination, spectacle. Lust and cruelty became threads of the same fabric. He forced senators' wives into his bed, shaming Rome's nobility in banquets, where their humiliation became entertainment. He transformed private acts into public displays, dragging the hidden into the torchlight, until shame itself became part of his rule. The palace no longer separated feasting from violence. Blood and lust mingled until the two were indistinguishable. Those who displeased him vanished. Those who pleased him were consumed by his appetites. The senators who once debated law now cowered, unsure if the emperor's laughter signalled favour or death. His sisters, whether willing or unwilling, were bound to him by chains not of iron, but of blood and necessity, their roles as wives, sisters, pawns, blurred until nothing remained but survival. For the Roman people, these stories became half rumour, half truth. Some claimed exaggeration, others swore they had seen with their own eyes. But whether true in every detail or not, the image of Caligula as the emperor who turned incest into ritual, cruelty into performance, and lust into governance burned itself into memory. His rule was not merely political, it was theatrical, grotesque, a carnival of shadows where Rome itself was the audience, horrified yet unable to look away. The nightmares of Caligula were not only personal, but imperial. He declared himself divine, demanded temples built in his honour, and walked through them dressed in the robes of gods. He made senators bow, not to Jupiter, but to him. The sacred was consumed by the profane, and in this theatre of divinity, the forbidden vows with his sisters no longer seemed taboo, but part of a larger script in which he alone decided what was sacred and what was sin. But no man, however crowned, can bend the world forever to his will. The same whispers that once followed him with awe now curdled into fear and resentment. His feasts of humiliation, his public displays of forbidden lust, his laughter at the expense of Rome's nobility. Each gesture carved enemies into the shadows. Even his sisters, once bound to him, became dangerous. To live near Caligula was to live in constant peril, for affection could become suspicion in a heartbeat, and suspicion often ended in death. The palace grew colder, darker. Guards watched one another with wary eyes. Senators smiled through gritted teeth. His nightmares became Rome's reality, until the city itself seemed soaked in unease. And then, as swiftly as it had begun, the storm ended. Daggers struck him down in a corridor, his body collapsing in the palace that had witnessed his rise and his ruin. The people who had once cheered his name stood silent, unsure whether to rejoice or tremble, for emperors could die, but the shadows they cast lingered long after their bodies were gone. And in that silence, one truth remained. Caligula's reign was not an aberration, it was a revelation. It showed what lay beneath the marble, behind the rituals, within the bloodlines. It showed what could happen when divine claims met human hunger, when blood purity became obsession, when family bonds were twisted into forbidden vows. His nightmares of blood and lust were not his alone. They were the empire's, the inevitable outcome of a dynasty that believed itself too sacred to obey the rules of mortals. Drusilla's image lingered in the memory of Rome, less as a goddess than as a reminder of how far emperors would go to preserve themselves, to enshrine their blood, to turn even their sisters into symbols of divine rule. Caligula's death did not end these practices, it only revealed them more starkly. The dynasty stumbled forward, wounded but unbroken, carrying with it the same fears, the same obsessions, the same shadows that had consumed him. The empire marched on, legions still conquering, markets still bustling, senators still debating in marble halls. But beneath it all, the memory of Caligula remained, a spectre in Rome's imagination, proof that the line between god and monster was perilously thin, and that in the name of blood and power, no vow was too sacred to break. When Rome's marble palaces fell silent, Europe entered an age where crowns no longer claimed descent from Jupiter, but from God. Yet beneath the prayers and coronations, the same fear endured, the fear of losing power through a diluted bloodline. The faith had changed, the rituals had changed, but the strategy remained. Kings married not for love, but to bind kingdoms together, to strengthen claims, to keep wealth and thrones locked within the family. It was here, across centuries of shifting crowns and crumbling castles, that one dynasty rose higher and lasted longer than almost any other. They were the Habsburgs, a family whose reach stretched across Europe, whose banners flew over Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and far beyond. For generations, they wielded marriage as their sharpest weapon. While others fought with steel, the Habsburgs conquered with weddings, weaving a web of unions that stretched from the Alps to the Americas. But every thread they wove was a thread that turned inward. To keep their empire intact, they married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, and in time, closer bonds still. Their motto might as well have been written in their faces. Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. And marry they did, until the faces themselves bore the marks of centuries of blood folded back upon itself. The Habsburg jaw, history calls it. A jutting chin, heavy lips, a face elongated, almost grotesque. It became the visible emblem of a dynasty that had married too closely, too often. In portraits, kings and queens stare out with solemn expressions, but their features betray the cost of keeping blood pure. Their faces tell the story that their chronicles did not, a story of fragility, of weakness, of decline hidden beneath robes of velvet and crowns of gold. Charles II of Spain became the most haunting figure of this legacy. He was the last of his line in Spain, a king born not of fortune, but of centuries of decisions that had left his bloodline a closed circle. His body was frail, his mind clouded, his health broken from birth. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, as though sorcery, and not his family's choices, had cursed him. He struggled to speak, to eat, to rule, and yet he bore the weight of an empire that stretched across oceans. Behind his eyes, one could see not the strength of his ancestors, but the collapse of them. Charles's story was not an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable culmination of generations of Habsburg marriages. From Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy, to Ferdinand and Isabella, to Philip and Joanna, the branches had been tied and retied until the family tree was no tree at all, but a circle closing upon itself. Marriages that were meant to unite kingdoms instead weakened them, binding not only territories, but illnesses, deformities, and frailty. The Habsburgs did not speak of these things openly. They spoke of divine right, of God's will, of crowns blessed by heaven. Their portraits showed majesty. Their palaces glittered. Their ceremonies dazzled. But the truth was visible for anyone who looked closely. The jaw, the heavy tongue, the frailty of heirs, the difficulty of producing children. It was all there, carved not into marble or parchment, but into flesh. And yet they persisted. To marry outside the family was to risk losing lands, to risk the empire's great patchwork of territories unravelling. Better, they thought, to fold blood upon blood than to let strangers claim what was theirs. So the dynasty clung to itself, a fortress of flesh and bone, until the very walls began to crumble. In the great halls of Madrid, Vienna, and Prague, one could hear both the music of triumph and the silence of decay. Feasts celebrated victories, but behind the curtains physicians whispered of weak heirs, of kings who could not father children, of queens who suffered in childbirth after unions too close, too fragile. The public saw splendour. The private chambers told a different story. Charles II died childless, and with him the Spanish branch of the Habsburg line. His body, examined in death, was said to be as twisted as his reign had been tragic, his organs shrunken, his frame malformed. It was not sorcery that had bewitched him, but the centuries of marriages that left his blood carrying both crowns and curses. His death sparked a war that dragged Europe into chaos, proof that the attempt to preserve power through inbreeding had instead destroyed it. But the Habsburgs endured elsewhere. Their Austrian line continued, their names still whispered in courts, their banners still flying. The jaw remained, a reminder carved into their features, even as their power waned. And with it lingered the lesson that dynasties rarely learn, that the obsession with purity, the fear of dilution, the marriage of blood to blood, may preserve power for a generation. But in time it corrodes both body and throne. The Habsburgs stand in history not as monsters, but as a mirror. Their portraits, painted with such solemnity, reveal what happens when fear guides destiny. They remind us that kings and queens are flesh as much as they are symbols, and that no crown can protect against the slow, inevitable consequences of choices made in the name of blood. The faces that look out from canvases in museums today carry more weight than the crowns they once bore. The heavy jaw, the sorrowful eyes, the pale lips. They tell a story that words alone cannot. A story of ambition, of fear, of bloodlines drawn too tightly. A story of how empires can collapse not only from the swords of enemies, but from the silent inheritance of their own choices. And so, the House of Habsburg remains one of the clearest examples of history's darkest unions. Not whispered rumours, not scandalous gossip, but faces carved by generations of inbreeding. Faces that could not hide the truth of their dynasty's obsession. They ruled for centuries, their reach vast, their power unmatched, yet their own bodies bore the cost. The broken faces of the Habsburgs are not merely relics of the past. They are warnings. They show us that history's darkest scandals were not always hidden in shadowed chambers, but sometimes sat openly on thrones, crowned and robed, their deformities visible to all. They remind us that the quest to keep power locked within a family can, in the end, destroy the family itself. And though their palaces still stand, though their portraits still hang, the dynasty is remembered not only for its vast empire, but for the curse it carried in its very blood, visible in every chin, every lip, every broken face that bore the weight of 1,000 forbidden unions. From the portraits he looks almost childlike, though painted as a king. The heavy jaw, the wide lips, the eyes that never quite meet yours. Behind the gilded frame hangs the weight of an empire, yet the boy within seems too fragile to bear even his own crown. He is Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, and perhaps the most haunting emblem of a dynasty devoured by its own fear of losing power. Spain in his time was not the Spain of Ferdinand and Isabella, conquerors of Granada and sponsors of Columbus. It was not the Spain of Charles V, whose empire stretched so wide that the sun seemed never to set upon it. By the late 17th century, the Spanish Empire was a colossus weakened by war, drained by silver, trembling beneath the cost of its own grandeur. And into this world, already brittle, was born a king too weak to rule, too broken to continue his line, yet destined to embody its decline. Charles's life began under an ill-omened shadow. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was herself the niece of her husband Philip IV. The family tree, twisted and folded upon itself for generations, had delivered a child who carried not the strength of his ancestors, but their accumulated frailty. From infancy, Charles was marked. His head grew too large for his body, his tongue so heavy that speech came slow and clumsy, his jaw jutting forward in the unmistakable mark of his family. Walking was difficult, eating a struggle, thinking clouded. Yet he was no ordinary child. He was the king-in-waiting of Spain. The court whispered. Some said he was bewitched, cursed by sorcery. Others saw what was plainer. A boy who was the victim, not of spells, but of choices. Choices made by centuries of rulers who feared outsiders more than weakness within, who believed that crowns must be bound by blood, even if the blood itself curdled. Charles became known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and in that nickname lay both pity and unease. It was easier, perhaps, for his subjects to believe in dark magic than in the harsher truth that their dynasty had undone itself. Raised in the royal palaces of Madrid, Charles lived more as a ward than as a prince. His mother ruled in his name for much of his reign, as regent, protector, and in truth, the actual power behind the throne. Ministers came and went, factions rose and fell, but the boy king remained in the shadows, his health too fragile, his mind too uncertain. When he was crowned, it was ceremony more than sovereignty. The crown rested upon his head, but the weight of the empire rested upon others. He tried, in his way, to be a king, but the simplest acts defeated him. Reading was difficult, his education limited, his speech so slow that counsels strained to follow. He relied on favourites and confessors, men who whispered advice that often served themselves more than Spain. In a court notorious for intrigue, he was prey rather than predator, the fragile centre of a storm of ambition. The kingdom itself mirrored its monarch. Armies that had once thundered across Europe now faltered. The silver galleons arriving from the New World brought wealth, but also inflation and corruption. Plague and famine stalked the countryside. The grandeur of El Escorial, the mighty palace monastery of his forebears, loomed as a monument to past glories rather than present power. Spain, like its king, bore the outward trappings of majesty, but within it was weakening, trembling, unravelling. Marriage was seen as Charles's only hope, not for love, but for survival. Twice he wed, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of the French king, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. Both unions were driven by desperation, each chosen in hopes of producing the heir who might secure Spain's future. But no child ever came. The years passed, the beds of kings grew cold, and Spain's court sank deeper into dread. Each failed attempt, each miscarriage or empty womb, echoed like a tolling bell. The dynasty's greatest fear, that the line would end, was coming true before their eyes. The more barren the marriages, the more the whispers grew. Physicians bled the king, priests performed exorcisms, astrologers searched the stars for signs. One tale speaks of his exhumed body revealing two hearts, others that his remains were shriveled, twisted, unnatural. Whether these were truths or myths hardly matters. What mattered was that the people believed them. To them, Charles was cursed, his body a vessel of failure, his reign a long twilight. And yet, for all his weakness, Charles was not cruel. Accounts describe him as gentle, pious, even kind. He prayed fervently, believed deeply, sought always the favour of heaven. His tragedy was not of malice, but of inheritance. He carried within him the choices of ancestors who had long placed empire above flesh, marriage above health, purity above survival. His body bore the crowns of Spain, Burgundy, Naples, the Netherlands, and more, but it also bore centuries of collapse folded within. When Charles II died in 1700, he was only 38. He left no heir, no child to continue the line, no strength to hold the empire together. His death was not the passing of one man, but the extinguishing of a dynasty. And with it came catastrophe. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, plunging Europe into years of conflict, as rivals scrambled to claim the spoils of a broken line. France, Austria, England, all sought to seize the fragments of an empire too vast to fall quietly. The tragedy of Charles II lies not only in his own frailty, but in what he represented. He was a king who could not rule, a man who could not continue his family, the end of a line that had once been among the mightiest in the world. His face, captured in oil and canvas, became the last signature of the Habsburg jaw, the last broken visage of a dynasty that had chosen insularity over survival. His life was the embodiment of how power, when hoarded too jealously, devours itself. Today, when visitors walk through the galleries of Madrid or Vienna, they sometimes stop before his portrait. The velvet, the lace, the solemn pose, all the trappings of majesty are there. But look closely at the mouth, the chin, the eyes, and you see the weight of history itself pressing down. His face is not merely his own. It is the face of a family, a strategy, an empire undone by its own fears. It is the face of Spain's last Habsburg king, a monarch who could not rule because he was already the living ruin of the blood that crowned him. The echo of Charles's reign lingers far beyond his death. It reminds us that the pursuit of dynastic purity, the obsession with keeping power sealed within a single family, does not guarantee strength. It ensures fragility. His story, woven into the greater fabric of royal inbreeding, is not an oddity, but a warning. For while his body failed him, it was not nature alone, but the deliberate choices of his ancestors that sealed his fate. And so Spain's last Habsburg king lives on in history not as a conqueror, not as a builder of empires, but as a figure of sorrow. His name is a closing chapter, his reign a twilight, his body a symbol of what happens when thrones are preserved, not by strength or wisdom, but by fear, and by bloodlines drawn too tightly. As Spain sank into twilight, its neighbours turned their gaze toward the vacant throne. Across the Pyrenees, in the sprawling palaces of France, whispers grew louder, carrying on the candlelit air of Versailles. The eyes of Europe were fixed on Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose glittering court shone brighter than any other. Beneath the chandeliers, beneath the measured bowing and the rustle of silk, alliances were being weighed, futures calculated, bloodlines measured like coin. Versailles was a world built to dazzle, to overwhelm, to make the visitor feel small before the grandeur of the monarch. Gold leaf on ceilings, mirrors stretching endlessly, fountains dancing in precise order. All of it was meant to declare the absolute power of one man. Yet power of this kind was never simply in armies or palaces. It was in the marriages arranged in secret, in the beds whispered about behind closed doors, in the genealogies that bound together houses of kings. France knew well the dangers of inbreeding, for its own history was marked with shadows of blood too closely tied. The Capetians and the Valois had tangled their lineages until cousin and spouse were sometimes the same. But Louis XIV understood the lesson of Spain's broken king. He had watched his nephew, Charles II, waste away on the Spanish throne, his frail body a testament to dynastic excess. France saw opportunity in Spain's decline, but also warning. Still, in the corridors of Versailles, where courtiers lined the king's path for a glance, for a nod, for a crumb of favour, it was difficult to tell where strategy ended and scandal began. Marriage was a weapon here, sharpened and wielded with elegance. Princesses were offered like chess pieces. Sons were betrothed before they had spoken their first words. Every union was weighed for its value, every bloodline studied for what it might yield. But alongside these careful calculations came whispers of something darker. The Bourbon line, like the Habsburgs, could not escape the lure of kinship. The closer the family, the more secure the alliance, and so though France outwardly mocked Spain's broken faces, its own kings quietly pursued unions that kept their blood close. Cousins wed cousins, nieces became brides. The line that stretched from Paris to Madrid, from the Bourbons to the Habsburgs, was drawn and redrawn until it formed a tangled knot. In the salons, behind painted fans and sly glances, rumours spread like smoke. A duchess, pale with powder, might lean to a companion and murmur of the Queen's health, of whether an heir would be born. A minister might warn that a proposed marriage brought blood too close to blood, yet the match would be made all the same, cloaked in ceremony, wrapped in piety. The court thrived on these whispers, feeding on them as much as on the banquets and ballets that filled its nights. Louis XIV himself set the tone. He was both a king and a father of dynasties, scattering children across France, both legitimate and otherwise. His marriages, his mistresses, his daughters married into powerful houses, all were part of the same relentless strategy to bind the Bourbon line across Europe. His descendants spread into Spain, into Italy, into the Holy Roman Empire. Where Spain had faltered, France sought to weave itself into the fabric of every crown. Yet even as France grew stronger, the seeds of the same decay were planted. The Bourbons who took the Spanish throne after Charles II carried with them the same dangers that had broken the Habsburgs. Cousins continued to wed. The family tree grew thicker, but not wider, its branches curling back upon themselves. Outwardly, the grandeur of Versailles masked these risks. Inwardly, they grew. The court itself seemed to mirror this contradiction. By day, it glittered with ritual. The king rose, and hundreds watched. He dined, and hundreds bowed. The smallest gesture became theatre, a performance of order and power, but at night, when the candles burned low, the same courtiers whispered of scandals too dangerous to speak aloud. Which union would produce heirs? Which would produce only frailty? Which princess was too closely tied by blood? Which match might preserve the crown, and which might doom it? France's strength was real, yet it was fragile, for it depended not only on armies, but on wombs, on births, on fragile bodies shaped by choices long past. In the hidden chambers, the Queen's labours were more important than any battle. Each cry of pain, each stillbirth, each frail child became a matter of state. The dynasty's future was written not only in treaties, but in blood, and that blood was increasingly folded upon itself. In this world, women were pawns and players alike. Queens and princesses bore the burden of producing heirs, often married to cousins they barely knew, expected to carry the weight of kingdoms in their bodies. Some succeeded, bearing sons who would become kings. Others failed, their names remembered only in whispers of sterility, miscarriages, and empty cradles. They were not women in the eyes of the court, but vessels of blood, instruments of dynasty. The French court was not yet broken as Spain's had been, but the danger was there, murmured in the shadows. For even as the Bourbons spread across Europe, the pattern of marrying within the family continued, a chain that would, in time, bring the same consequences. The lesson of Charles II was present in every whispered prayer for a healthy heir, in every anxious glance at a child king. The glittering mirrors of Versailles reflected not only grandeur, but fragility, for every crown rested on the thinnest foundation of flesh. And so, the court whispered, whispers of power, of scandal, of forbidden unions and fragile heirs, whispers that could not be silenced by gold or music, that echoed even in the grandest halls. The faces in the portraits smiled with majesty, but behind them, the same story unfolded. The relentless pursuit of dynastic purity, the fear of losing power, the slow corrosion that came when kings married too closely, when blood itself became both the foundation and the floor of empires. The silence after Charles II's death had not ended, it had only shifted. It lingered now in Versailles, in the heavy air of gilded rooms, in the whispers that never ceased. France, for all its splendour, carried the same shadow. And within that shadow, history's darkest unions waited to repeat themselves. Long before the chandeliers of Versailles threw their fractured light across mirrored walls, before the Spanish Habsburg jaw became a symbol of decline, Europe's royal houses had already been laying their foundations in silken chambers and candlelit halls. It was in the medieval world that the pattern was first woven, a pattern of beds where crowns and bloodlines tangled, where desire was silenced in favour of strategy, and where the fate of entire kingdoms was sealed not by swords, but by marriages arranged behind carved wooden doors. In castles that rose above rivers and moors, kings and queens lived not as individuals, but as vessels of dynastic survival. Every marriage was a contract, every bed an alliance, every child a potential soldier or sovereign. Love was rarely considered, duty was everything. Yet in the quiet of those chambers, madness brewed, madness born of desperation, of fear, of bloodlines folded too tightly until the heirs who were meant to save kingdoms instead carried their ruin within their veins. The medieval world was fragmented, kingdoms small and brittle, each threatened by its neighbours. To bind them together, marriages were struck. A daughter sent across mountains became a treaty. A son married to his cousin became a claim to a throne. And with each generation, the circle grew tighter. Cousins wed cousins. Nephews wed aunts. Lines that should have branched outward bent inward instead, like vines growing around themselves until the stems snapped. Consider England, where the Plantagenets spread their roots across centuries. Their blood was fierce, their ambition endless, but their alliances often turned to suspicion, and suspicion to betrayal. Cousins married to cousins produced heirs who fought one another, plunging the realm into wars, as much of blood as of steel. The Wars of the Roses were fought not merely on battlefields, but in the tangled genealogies of houses too closely tied, where every claimant to the throne shared the same blood, yet claimed it more fiercely than the next. Or look to the French, where the Capetians built their dynasty upon unions so tight that the family tree reads less like a spreading oak and more like a knot. Brothers' children married, uncles bound themselves to nieces. The aim was to keep the kingdom intact, to prevent foreign hands from seizing the crown. Yet the result was a chain of weak heirs, child kings guided by regents, dynasties so fragile that one fever could unravel their legacy. The madness of medieval beds was not confined to Western Europe. In the kingdoms of Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, the same fears played out. Blood was guarded more jealously than treasure, and with the same logic, it must never leave the family. But blood is not gold. It cannot be hoarded without consequence. The children of these unions bore the signs: infant deaths, twisted spines, fragile bodies that could not survive the burdens placed upon them. In the courts of Aragon and Castile, where marriage would one day unite Spain, the pattern was already visible. Queens wed cousins, kings bound themselves to nieces, and heirs grew fewer, frailer. The union of Ferdinand and Isabella, celebrated for uniting Spain and launching voyages across oceans, was itself the child of centuries of cousin marriages. Their success masked the peril that lay ahead, a peril embodied in the pale and sorrowful figure of their daughter, Joanna of Castile, remembered not as a ruler, but as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Her story is a testament to the madness bred in royal chambers. Married to Philip of Burgundy, she bore children who would become kings and queens of Spain, Portugal, and the Low Countries. Yet her mind unravelled, whether from illness or from the strain of her marriage, or perhaps from the weight of a bloodline already weakened. Locked away for decades, she became both a symbol and a victim. The dynasty continued through her body, but she herself was erased. Her children would inherit crowns, but they also inherited the fragility that would culminate, generations later, in Charles II. These were not isolated tragedies, but patterns repeated across kingdoms. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling and unstable, was bound together by marriages that brought no new strength, only recycled weakness. The Luxembourgs, the Wittelsbachs, the Habsburgs, each guarded their bloodlines, each married within, each believed that purity meant survival. Yet all too often, it meant heirs unfit to rule, monarchs childless, crowns passed not through strength but through desperation. And still, the strategy persisted. To marry outside the family was seen as betrayal. It was to risk land slipping away into foreign hands. Better to wed a cousin than to see half a kingdom lost. Better to fold the family upon itself than to trust an outsider with power. The logic was relentless, and it seemed unbreakable. But the cost was written in the bodies of the heirs, in their frail limbs, their fragile minds, their childless marriages. The madness of these beds was not only physical, but political. When cousins married cousins, their children carried claims to multiple thrones. One child might be heir to England and France, another to Spain and Burgundy. These overlapping claims ignited wars that consumed generations. Dynasties sought security through these unions, yet what they often bred was conflict. Wars fought not against strangers, but between kin. The medieval imagination cloaked this madness in piety. Priests blessed the unions, chroniclers wrote of destiny, courts celebrated the weddings with feasts and tournaments. Yet beneath the music and the prayers, the truth remained. These marriages were prisons. Daughters were traded like coin. Sons were bound before they could speak. Their lives were not their own. but the continuation of a strategy that sought to preserve power at any cost. In the silence of monasteries, some chroniclers hinted at the danger. They wrote of kings whose bodies failed them, of queens who wept in childbirth, of dynasties that ended with a whimper rather than a triumph. But these voices were faint, drowned out by the roar of ceremony and the glitter of crowns. The madness could not be spoken aloud, for to question the marriages was to question the very foundation of monarchy itself. And so the pattern continued, from England to France, from Aragon to Austria, from Hungary to Bohemia. Kings married cousins, nieces, even uncles to their nieces. The family trees grew twisted. The heirs grew weaker, the kingdoms grew more fragile. The medieval world, in its fear of losing power, sowed the seeds of its own decline. The whispers of Versailles and the broken faces of the Habsburgs were not new. They were echoes of this older madness, the madness of royal beds in medieval Europe. In those dark chambers, beneath stone arches and candlelight, the future of kingdoms was written in flesh. And as the centuries passed, the consequences of those choices would rise again and again, haunting crowns from Spain to France, from Austria to beyond. Beyond the castles of Europe, past the grey rivers and snowbound forests, the story of royal blood takes on a different shade. The East, Byzantium, the lands of the Ottomans, the kingdoms where silk moved as easily as steel, was no stranger to dynastic fear. Thrones here too were fragile, their crowns coveted, their rulers always one step away from betrayal. And as in the West, the answer often seemed to lie in bloodlines drawn too tightly, in marriages and unions that closed ranks rather than opened them. The Eastern court shimmered with grandeur. Marble palaces gleamed under torchlight. Mosaics glittered like stars. Gardens spilled with scents of jasmine and myrrh. Yet behind the jewelled gates, the logic of survival was the same as in Europe's damp castles. To keep a dynasty alive, to ensure its dominion stretched into the future, rulers often turned not outward but inward, binding themselves to sisters, cousins, nieces. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern echo, was perhaps the most dazzling theatre for such unions. Its emperors ruled not only with armies, but with ceremony, with pageants so grand they seemed divine. The Byzantines called their capital, the Queen of Cities, Constantinople, and within its walls the throne was treated as a sacred thing. To ascend it was to become almost godlike, and therefore its inheritance had to be protected at any cost. That cost was often exacted in marriages of unsettling intimacy. Imperial daughters, kept within the purple chambers of the palace, were rarely allowed to marry beyond the dynasty. Their bodies, like their dowries, belonged not to them, but to the empire. A niece might be given to her uncle if it meant the throne would remain in one bloodline. A cousin might be bound to another cousin if it meant no rival house could gain a claim. These marriages were celebrated as triumphs of continuity, yet beneath the hymns and incense was the same slow erosion that would one day undo the empire itself. One name that drifts through these stories is that of Constantine IX, whose reign in the 11th century saw the empire gilded yet hollow. His wives and mistresses traced lines through the court that were less about affection and more about control. Byzantine chroniclers, often monks, wrote cautiously, veiling their accounts with hints rather than open judgment. Yet the patterns are clear. Unions that folded the imperial family upon itself, generation after generation, until heirs grew weak, until rival claimants fractured the court, until civil wars erupted not between nations, but between cousins. The Byzantines inherited more than Rome's crown. They inherited Rome's willingness to bend laws when power demanded it. Though the church frowned on marriages too close in kinship, exceptions were made for emperors. A union that would scandalize among the faithful could be sanctified if it ensured stability for the throne. Bloodlines that should have spread outward instead circled back, weaving a knot so tight it could not be undone. Beyond Byzantium, the Ottomans built their own empire on the ruins of others, and their palaces told another story of blood. In the halls of Topkapi, where fountains murmured and tiles shone like sapphire, the sultans ruled not just by conquest, but by the silence of their harems. For the Ottomans, the threat was not from daughters married outward, but from sons born within. Each prince was a potential rival, each child of the harem a future claimant. It was here that incest took on a different shape, not always in sanctioned marriages, but in whispered rumours, in tales of sultans who kept their sisters too close, of princes who took liberties with their kin in the hidden chambers where no chronicler could freely write. Ottoman power was sustained by strangling rivals, by secluding brothers, by ensuring that the line of succession was clear. Yet the very structure of the harem created spaces where boundaries blurred, where desire and duty collided in ways never openly recorded but often suspected. The Safavid dynasty of Persia, too, is remembered for its gilded splendour and its shadows. Shahs crowned themselves as almost divine beings, protectors of the faith. Yet they too were bound by fear of losing their fragile line. Cousins married cousins, nieces wed uncles, dynasties closed in upon themselves. Chroniclers tell of heirs weakened, of madness seeping into courts where incense and power mingled. The blood of kings was treated as sacred, yet it was passed down as though it were trapped in a vessel too small, growing stale, corrupted by its own confinement. Even further east, in the courts of the Mughals, whispers persisted of bonds too close. Their empire was vast, their courts fragrant with spices, heavy with jewels, but the fear of division haunted them. Dynasties that stretched across Asia faced the same question as those in Europe and Byzantium: how to keep the crown from splintering? The answer too often was the same: keep the marriages within the family. Ensure that the throne's blood was never diluted. But blood does not obey dynastic fears. It carries its own memory, its own weaknesses, its own revenge. The children of these Eastern unions bore the same signs as those of the West: shortened lives, fragile bodies, minds troubled by shadows. Palaces might gleam brighter than any European castle, but the fragility of the heirs was the same. In Byzantium, one finds tales of emperors childless despite multiple marriages, of heirs who died in infancy, of dynasties broken because the line simply failed. In the Ottoman court, the cycle of fratricide often left a single heir who carried the weight of not just empire, but of bloodline, bent and twisted by the very measures meant to preserve it. In Persia, the Safavids dwindled into weakness, their courts filled with intrigue, but their dynasties hollowed from within. What binds these stories together is the silence. Unlike the chroniclers of the West, who sometimes whispered of deformities or madness, Eastern historians often cloaked their accounts in reverence. To admit that the blood of a Shah, a Sultan, or a Basileus was tainted was unthinkable. And yet the evidence was there, written not in words, but in the fate of dynasties that rose in splendour and fell in fragility. The incest of the East was no less real, no less damaging. It was hidden behind veils of piety, cloaked in ritual, protected by the secrecy of harems and the sanctity of palaces. But it followed the same logic. Crowns must remain within the family, no matter the cost. And as always, the cost was exacted from the children who bore the weight of those decisions, who carried in their bodies the weaknesses bred from fear. The East, like the West, built its glory on fragile foundations. Thrones carved from marble, palaces draped in silk, courts perfumed with rosewater. All of it was haunted by the same truth. blood, folded upon itself too many times, carries shadows. Dynasties that thought themselves eternal found themselves crumbling, not from the swords of their enemies, but from the fragility of the heirs they placed upon their thrones. And so, as the Byzantine mosaics faded, as Ottoman fountains stilled, as Safavid palaces cracked, the story of royal incest revealed itself again. Not an aberration, but a pattern written across East and West alike, in crowns that glittered, in beds that whispered, in the fragile breath of heirs who were never meant to carry so much history within their veins. Across palaces of marble and stone, across temples and cathedrals, there always lingered the same question. If the throne was sacred, could the sins required to preserve it be forgiven? Kings and emperors, queens and consorts, all knew that their crowns did not rest solely on armies or wealth. They were fastened by the invisible weight of religion. A crown glimmered brighter when blessed by priests, when kissed by bishops, when held aloft as though it were handed down from heaven itself. But what happens when the blood that fills the veins of kings is already corrupted, not by foreign enemies, but by choices too close to home? Could prayers wash away the shadows of incest? Could sacraments cleanse the twisted unions that produced heirs with trembling hands, fragile hearts, and troubled minds? Faith was invoked again and again as a salve, as though the sins of dynasties could be absolved in the glow of candlelight. Yet faith, powerful as it was, could not change the laws written in blood. The medieval world clung to the belief that the church could sanctify nearly anything. If brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, or cousins sought to marry, a papal dispensation could be secured. A letter sealed with wax could transform what was forbidden into what was permitted. And so, beneath vaulted ceilings echoing with chants, priests raised their hands over marriages that whispered of scandal. The union was declared holy, the bedchamber sanctified, even as the consequences of such union seeped quietly into the generations that followed. The Habsburgs knew this ritual well. Their devotion to the Catholic faith was matched only by their devotion to their own dynasty. Their kings and queens filled chapels with gold and silver, endowing monasteries, kneeling in confession, taking communion with solemnity. Yet behind these acts of piety, their marriages closed tighter and tighter around the family circle. A cousin wedded to a cousin, an uncle to a niece, sometimes even closer ties disguised beneath the blessing of the church. The Habsburg lip, the jutting jaw that made eating and speaking difficult, became a mark not of divine favour, but of faith's failure to protect against the logic of biology. In Spain, the last Habsburg king, Charles II, was prayed over endlessly. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to begging God for his health, for his fertility, for his ability to continue the line. Pilgrimages were made in his name, relics touched to his fragile body, masses sung in endless repetition. And yet, despite all this devotion, his body bore the scars of centuries of inbreeding. He was sickly, often unable to walk without support, his jaw so misshapen he struggled to chew. He died childless, and with him died a branch of empire that had stretched across oceans. Faith could not undo what blood had already written. The idea that divine blessing might purify bloodlines was not limited to Europe. In Byzantium, emperors who married within their own families did so under the watchful eye of the Orthodox Church. Incense filled the Hagia Sophia, hymns rose to heaven, and priests intoned blessings as brides were led to altars to marry men who were their uncles or cousins. It was said that God had sanctified the union, that what might scandalize among common folk was justified for rulers, chosen to mirror divine order. And yet, generation after generation, the same pattern unfolded. Heirs weak, dynasties fragile, lines broken not by enemies at the gate, but by sickness within the palace walls. Religion's power was immense, but its reach was not infinite. It could crown kings, absolve their sins, justify their wars, and declare their marriages holy. But no blessing, no relic, no prayer could alter the silent arithmetic of inheritance. When a family folded too tightly upon itself, no holy water could dilute what had already thickened into shadow. In France, the Capetians, and later the Bourbons, wrapped themselves in Catholic devotion. Kings were called the most Christian. Their touch was believed to heal disease, their coronations suffused with ritual. Yet even here, where faith was woven into the very identity of monarchy, marriages too close to the bloodline crept in. Each time, a bishop's pen excused it. Each time, faith was called upon to make what was unnatural seem ordained. The result was always the same. Heirs weakened, dynasties destabilized, faith unable to protect what nature refused to sustain. The paradox was cruel. Monarchs turned to faith not only for legitimacy, but for protection. When their choices defied the church's own laws, they begged for dispensations, and more often than not, received them. Faith was pliable when crowns were at stake, but pliability came at a cost. The very institution that claimed to guard morality ended up blessing unions that hastened dynastic decay. For the rulers themselves, perhaps the weight of religion made the choices easier. To marry a niece, to take a cousin as queen, might have troubled the conscience. But if the church approved, if a priest declared it holy, then the sin felt lighter, softened by ritual. In the flicker of candles, surrounded by chanting, it was easy to believe that God himself had sanctioned the bed. Still, behind the piety, the same anxieties crept in. What if the weakness of an heir was punishment? What if the madness of a prince was judgment? What if the sterility of a king was not nature but divine wrath? Monarchs prayed harder, gave more alms, built grander chapels, hoping to buy forgiveness or perhaps divine intervention. But no amount of marble or gold could silence the truth their children carried in their veins. In this way, religion became not a shield, but a mirror. It reflected the desperation of dynasties that could not stop turning inward. It showed how fear of losing a throne led kings to choices that no prayer could sanctify. And in the end, when the last heirs gasped their final breaths, the churches were full, the candles lit, the prayers rising, but the bloodline still ended. The story of faith and incest is not one of salvation, but of illusion. Monarchs believed that religion could cleanse what they had chosen, that the blessing of a priest could erase the consequences of biology. They knelt, they confessed, they received communion with trembling lips, and then they returned to palaces where their brides were also their kin. The silence of history is filled with their prayers. Kings whispering in chapels, queens clutching rosaries, priests assuring them of forgiveness. But no whisper, no bead, no blessing could prevent the slow collapse of families that had turned inward too many times. Faith built cathedrals that still stand, but it could not build stronger heirs. And so, as the bells of monasteries tolled, as the incense rose to painted ceilings, dynasties dissolved one by one. The lesson was written not in scripture, but in the bodies of those who wore crowns. Faith could promise eternity, but blood told the truth. And that truth was merciless. In the half-lit chambers of palaces, where marble echoed with the footsteps of courtiers, and the air was thick with incense and whispers, there appeared a recurring figure, the prince who was never meant to rule, yet who wore a crown too heavy for his body. History remembers their faces with a strange tenderness and unease. Boys, pale as wax, men frail as glass, rulers so fragile that kingdoms trembled more at their coughs than at the armies of their enemies. The crowns that passed onto their heads glittered, but beneath those crowns were bodies that betrayed the dynasty itself. Some could not walk without stumbling, others could not speak clearly, others still suffered fits of madness that left their courts trembling. These princes were not weak from lack of courage, but from the weight of their blood. The centuries of marriages folded inward, the dynasties that chose themselves again and again until their heirs bore the price. Spain knew this fate well. Charles II, remembered as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the final echo of the Habsburg dynasty there. His crown was of gold, but his body was a ruin. His jaw jutted forward so severely that he struggled to chew. His tongue, heavy and awkward, made speech nearly unintelligible. He was plagued by seizures, by fevers, by a body that seemed constantly at war with itself. Ministers, priests, and even physicians circled around him, not as advisors, but as desperate guardians, each praying that he would somehow provide an heir. Yet every attempt failed. Behind palace walls, the silence of his bedchamber was as damning as the battles lost on distant frontiers. Courtiers turned to exorcisms, to relics pressed against his chest, to masses sung at dawn and dusk. Yet no ritual could disguise what was plain to see. Charles was the end of his line. His crown slipped further down the path of ruin with each passing year, not because of invading armies, but because the blood that filled his veins had been stretched too thin, bent too far. And Spain was not alone. In Austria, too, the Habsburgs crowned sons who bore the signs of exhaustion. Some were infertile, others frail, many dead before their 30th year. Their portraits, hung in gilded frames, reveal faces marked by the same protruding jaw, the same hollowed eyes, the same pallor that seemed less like youth and more like a foreshadowing. Behind those portraits lies a quieter truth, an empire ruled by men who were too weak to lead, whose crowns crumbled not in battle, but in the silence of sick rooms. France bore its share as well. The Bourbon princes who followed Louis XIV were ghosts compared to their radiant ancestor. Smallpox swept through the royal family like a curse, but so too did frailty of blood. Dauphins who might have ruled instead died young, coughing blood, or wasting away in shadows. In Versailles, the Sun King's palace of mirrors and endless light, the glow could not conceal how fragile the line had become. Each death left courtiers murmuring in candlelit galleries, each new heir weaker than the last, each crown passed with more desperation than triumph. In England, the Tudor and Stuart houses faced their own cruel fates. Henry VIII's obsession with securing a male heir was not merely vanity, it was the echo of fear that dynasties already whispered about, the fear of weak or sickly princes. Edward VI, the boy king, ascended with promise, but wasted away before his 17th year, coughing and pale. His crown outlived him, sliding onto heads unprepared, while his body gave in to the frailty that had shadowed his short reign. Later in the Stuart line, heirs struggled with illnesses that blurred the line between physical weakness and the inherited strains of their blood. Across Europe, the same story unfolded. Sickly princes seated on thrones that seemed more like funeral pyres. Their reigns were filled not with conquests or reforms, but with whispers of doctors, prayers of priests, and anxious waiting. The fate of kingdoms depended on whether a prince survived the winter, whether a cough deepened, whether a body too delicate could withstand the weight of rule, and yet these fragile rulers were still cloaked in ritual. Coronations proceeded with grandeur, crowns placed upon trembling heads, anthems sung as though eternity had been secured. Behind the music, however, courtiers knew the truth. The heir was frail, The line was brittle. The dynasty itself was cracking. It is tempting to see these princes as tragic figures, but they were also symbols of dynastic arrogance. Their weakness was not their fault. It was the inheritance forced upon them. They carried the sins of generations, of uncles who married nieces, of cousins bound in unions too close, of families that closed their gates against the world. The weakness of their bodies was the voice of history itself, reminding dynasties that crowns cannot outwit nature forever. Some tried to mask it. Portraits painted with flattering light. Artists commanded to soften features. Chroniclers instructed to write of strength where none existed. But time revealed what paint and words could not hide. The crowns crumbled because the princes beneath them could not stand. Their bodies collapsed before their thrones did, and in their deaths, empires fractured. The Ottomans, too, suffered this slow decay. Princes raised in the silence of the harem often emerged delicate, unprepared for the brutality of rule. Years of confinement, of isolation, left them weak in body and uncertain in mind. When they inherited, their reigns often staggered under the weight of their own inexperience and frailty. The practice of fratricide, meant to preserve strong succession, left heirs who were alone, fragile, haunted. Their crowns rested on men more like shadows than rulers, their bodies already bent before the empire itself began to decline. The pattern is relentless. Whether in the west or the east, in marble palaces or wooden castles, the crowns that once seemed eternal grew lighter, more fragile, easier to topple. And always the figure at the centre was the same. The sickly prince, cloaked in velvet too heavy, his pale face lit by candles, his courtiers whispering prayers that never reached beyond the ceiling beams. These crowns were not stolen by invaders, or toppled by revolutions alone. They were undone from within, by the very heirs they produced. Bloodlines that sought to preserve themselves by turning inward had instead hollowed themselves out. The princes who wore their crowns could not bear the weight of empire, and so, quietly, without the clash of swords, the crowns began to crumble. There is a peculiar silence in these stories, the silence of sick rooms where rulers lay sweating, the silence of courtiers pacing outside chamber doors, the silence of dynasties holding their breath as kingdoms waited. No proclamations, no victories, only waiting, waiting to see if a body too fragile could outlast a crown too heavy. More often than not, it did not. In the end, the story of sickly princes is the story of dynasties devouring themselves. Crowns once symbols of eternity became fragile ornaments resting on trembling brows. Empires learned too late that faith, ritual and ceremony could not protect heirs born already broken by the choices of their ancestors. The crowns crumbled, not in a single night, but slowly, in coughs, in fevers, in childless beds, in shadows where the weight of blood was too much to bear. The palaces that once rang with laughter, with processions, with the music of triumph, now stand quiet. The banners that once fluttered in the wind fall into dust, their colours faded, their emblems meaningless. What remains are walls that witness too much, and voices that echo only in memory. When dynasties turned inward, when they chose their own reflection above the world beyond, their undoing was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The silence that followed their fall was not sudden. It was the slow fading of a song until only the air remembered the tune. Look closely at the fate of the Habsburgs. Their story was not ended by sword or cannon, but by the exhaustion of their own line. Their obsession with keeping crowns within their own family, binding cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, emperor to relative, was meant to preserve the purity of their rule. Instead, it hollowed them out. Charles II of Spain, frail and childless, left behind no heir to carry his crown. His death was not merely the end of a reign, it was the silence of centuries of ambition, collapsing into nothing. The grand palaces of Madrid still stand, but their halls remember that moment, the day when the line ended with a sigh rather than a shout. The Bourbons of France knew a similar silence. Versailles, once alive with light, echoed with emptiness as heirs died young, as bloodlines thinned, as the grandeur of the Sun King gave way to shadows. Revolution tore through them eventually, but even before the guillotine, decline had already taken root in sick rooms and funerals. The laughter of children had grown rarer, the songs of coronations quieter. By the time the people rose, the dynasty was already hollow, a body eaten from within long before the blade fell. In England, the Tudors left only silence where once there had been spectacle. Henry VIII's desperate search for heirs produced only Edward, frail and fading, and daughters whose reigns could not continue the line. The Tudor dynasty, built on blood and ambition, simply ended. The silence that followed was not tragic for all. New rulers rose, but for the dynasty itself, it was the quiet of a family that had consumed itself with its own desperation. The Stuarts, too, dwindled into whispers, their heirs plagued by illness, their thrones slipping from beneath them. The Ottomans, vast and mighty, faced a decline just as insidious. Their princes, once raised in the art of war and governance, were shut away in the harem, their childhood spent in silence and shadows. By the time they inherited, they were fragile, untested, ill-suited to rule. The empire that had thundered across continents grew quieter, its rulers more like ghosts than conquerors. The silence here was not only of bloodlines, but of spirit, an empire devouring itself through fear of its own heirs. Across history, these dynasties tell the same story. Inbreeding, isolation, desperate attempts to preserve power within closed circles. It left heirs broken, fragile, or entirely absent. The crowns remained, glittering in treasuries and atop velvet cushions, but without heads strong enough to bear them, the crowns became relics instead of symbols. The silence that followed was the truest mark of their failure. But silence does not only belong to empty thrones. It lingers in portraits that stare from museum walls. Look at their faces. Jaws that jutted too far. Eyes that seemed too vacant. Skin painted pale as parchment. These portraits were once meant to display power and dignity. Now they whisper of fragility, of lives cut short, of lines that could not last. Each brushstroke carries the silence of a dynasty that believed itself eternal, only to discover that even kings cannot escape the rules of blood and bone. The silence is also in the archives. Records of marriages between uncles and nieces, of cousins bound together not by love, but by strategy. Documents of coronations that crowned boys who could barely stand, or men whose bodies were already rotting beneath their robes. Papers sealed with wax that once commanded armies, now brittle and fading. The ink outlasts the names it wrote, but the silence beneath the words is unmistakable. And the silence echoes still in the ruins. Castles left abandoned, their stones darkened, their windows shattered. Thrones that sit empty in halls too grand for their emptiness. Chapels where priests once prayed for heirs now echo only with the footsteps of visitors who come to see what remains. The silence of dynasties devouring themselves is not only in the absence of heirs, it is in the absence of meaning, when glory collapses into relics. These rulers believed they were eternal. They built monuments to themselves, wrote laws in their names, struck coins with their profiles. Yet eternity does not belong to men, no matter their crowns. Eternity belongs to silence, and silence came for them all. Think of Spain, once ruling continents, its ships crossing oceans, its kings commanding worlds. It ended in silence, with Charles II staring into emptiness, his body too frail, his crown too heavy, his line dissolved. Think of France, with its mirrored halls, its endless banquets, its dazzling rituals. It ended in silence, the laughter replaced by the hiss of the blade, the palace standing as a monument to ghosts. Think of Austria, where the Habsburgs continued for centuries, but weaker, thinner, until they, too, were swept aside, not with a roar, but with a weary sigh. And yet, silence is not only their punishment, it is their legacy, because silence tells the story more truthfully than their triumphs ever did. Silence reveals what their chronicles tried to hide, what their portraits tried to soften, what their ceremonies tried to disguise. The silence that followed their fall is the purest echo of the truth, that dynasties that turn inward devour themselves, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of history. And so the crowns lie still. The bloodlines are dust. The names survive in books, but the voices are gone. No more sickly princes wheezing in palace chambers, no more kings marrying nieces in the name of empire, no more mothers turned queens, no more sons turned husbands, only silence remains. It is not the silence of peace, nor of rest, but of absence. The silence of palaces that once thundered with ambition, of families that sought eternity and found only fragility. It is the silence of dynasties that devoured themselves, and in their destruction remind us of the truth that crowns cannot outlive the bodies that wear them. History hums with wars, with victories, with revolutions. But beneath it all, if you listen closely, there is always silence waiting, the silence of endings, the silence of bloodlines consumed by themselves, the silence of dynasties that believed they could master fate only to discover they could not. And in that silence, history sleeps. And so the candles burn low, and the echoes of our story settle into silence. We've wandered through chambers where crowns were heavier than they appeared, where kings married not for love but for blood, where mothers became brides and dynasties slowly folded in on themselves. What we faced together tonight were not battles of armies or the rise and fall of empires in fire and steel. Instead, we stood in the quieter places, the bedchambers, the whispered rituals, the shadows that history often tries to hide. We saw how the desire to keep blood pure became its own curse, how power devoured itself from within, and how faces stamped on coins began to blur until even kings looked fragile. Tell me, as you drift deeper into thought, what stayed with you the most? Was it the pharaohs who bound themselves to their sisters in the name of gods? Was it the emperors of Rome, drunk on power and breaking boundaries no mortal should cross? Or perhaps it was the Habsburgs, with their haunted jaws, proof that a family tree too tightly wound becomes a trap. Each of these stories, strange as they seem, was not whispered in secret corridors alone. They were lived in golden palaces, under painted ceilings, by rulers who believed themselves chosen by heaven. And yet, even with crowns, even with armies, they could not escape the shadows they created with their own choices. History reminds us that power is never simple. It is not just parades and banners. Sometimes it is loneliness. Sometimes it is silence. And sometimes it is the heavy burden of keeping a dynasty alive, even if it meant breaking the very boundaries of family itself. As you let the story rest in your mind tonight, I want to hear from you. Which part of this tale lingered with you? Which dynasty? Which scandal? Which shadow behind the throne felt the most haunting? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and together they make these stories feel less forgotten. And if you've made it this far into the quiet, then you're part of this circle now. Before you close your eyes, take a second to subscribe to the channel. It keeps these histories alive, lets them reach others across the world, and brings us back together for the next journey into the past. Until then, rest well wherever you are. The shadows of history will still be here, waiting.